Okay, I guess we will begin. The good thing about a Zoom call is that late arrivers can come in very discreetly, and we welcome them when they arrive. But for now, we'll get started. My name is Jennifer Hill, and I am the Director of Assessment in Trinity College. And my office has a lot of different types of responsibilities, but the most important of which is to help Duke faculty, staff, and students express their goals for student learning and to try to understand and tell the story of the student experience at Duke. And like many of you, I am new to the study of transformative learning. I am coming to this conversation today with deep interest in the ways that this community, myself, how we describe, and maybe how we try to estimate transformation and learning among our students. And I have a co-host today, Professor David Malone, whom many of you know. David, a little metaphor came to mind a moment ago that we are like the co-hosts on the holiday parades who go back and forth talking about the floats that pass by. That's you and me today.
I love holiday parades.
Me too.
So I will love today. So, hi, I'm David Malone, and I'm a faculty member in the Duke Program in Education and Director of Duke Service Learning. I want to first just thank all the students for being here. In Duke University's strategic plan, Together Duke, it only has 4 goals. I've mentioned this to my students. Goal number 2 reads, provide a transformative learning educational experience for all students. 4 goals, a 100-page document. 1 goal is all about transformative learning. Yet I've read this thing 4 or 5 times, and nowhere in the university's plan is there a definition of transformative learning. There's never an articulation of what the teaching strategies or enabling conditions are that lead to transformation. Our students have little understanding of what transformative learning is. I don't think our faculty has an understanding of what transformative learning is. Some of our students have said to me that they see transformative learning as just another form of privilege and whiteness. So one of the questions I know we're going to talk about today is, how did we ever move from Paulo Freire's radical notions of transformative learning and critical consciousness to this more mainstream use of the phrase transformative learning as a marketing strategy? So I thank Dr. Kiely for being here, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
And let me introduce our guest who's joining us today from Western New York. It's a great pleasure to welcome to Duke virtually, Professor Richard Kiely from Cornell. In the US as well as internationally, Professor Kiely has been a thought leader and an expert practitioner in service learning as well as civic engagement. He serves now as Senior Fellow in Cornell's Office of Engagement Initiatives. He was inaugural director of Cornell's Center of Community Engaged Learning and Research, which now I believe, Richard, is called the Office of Engagement Initiatives, which supports the Engaged Cornell Initiative, which I also believe was your strategic plan. Richard's PhD is from Cornell, and thereafter he was an assistant professor in the Department of Lifelong Education, Policy, and Administration at the University of Georgia. He taught courses in community development, qualitative methods, community-based research, global service learning, program planning, learning theory. We really have an expert with us this evening. 15 years ago, in 2005, Richard was recognized nationally as a John Glenn Scholar in Service Learning for his contributions to a model of transformative learning. And thereafter, he served as the faculty director of the Cornell Urban Scholars Program and the Cornell Urban Mentor Initiative. He has taught qualitative research, community-based research, pre- and post-fieldwork courses. I believe, Richard, your current research focuses on student learning, faculty development, partnerships, institutional approaches in the field of community-engaged learning and research. And you were the co-founder of a community-driven global service learning partnership in Nicaragua, which just completed its 25th year. So we congratulate Richard on the success and longevity of these programs and initiatives, and we welcome him to our conversations about learner transformations in community-based global learning. Before we allow Richard actually to say anything, I do want to also recognize the Transformative Learning intellectual community, which was convened by Professors Corey Crane, Joan Clifford, and Deb Reisinger. If they could all wave for us. I'd like to recognize the leadership and the vision you had to bring these ideas, these conversations to fruition in this academic year. And what a year it is to study transformative learning. Also part of our team, Professors Melissa Simmermeyer, David Malone, whom you've met, Jennifer Ahern Dodson, Liliana Paredes, Dr. Alessandra Dinnan, who is managing the poll. Thank you so much, Alessandra, and myself. We recognize Joan for her effort in bringing tonight's event together. And also thank you to Ruth Eccles in the program and education for a lot of her assistance throughout the planning process. We invite you to be active participants in the chat. Joan is going to keep an eye on the chat for us. We're going to have a couple more polls throughout the evening. Please interact as much as you are comfortable with. We are all here, albeit at different stages of our learning journey. There's much we can learn from each other. Alessandra, could you post the poll results for us? Okay, so a vast majority of participants tonight are students. Now, I guess have a staff appointment, but I am a student too. We are all constantly learning. There's much I am learning from my colleagues this year in the area of transformative learning. And how much exposure have you had? Minorities are well read and have considered the application of scholarship or the theoretical foundations to teaching practice, but the majority of us have read a little bit, but we're still unsure what to make of it or how to bring it into our professional or academic lives. And another 15% of us don't know yet, are just starting the journey. So all are welcome. And with that, David, I'll let you sort of throw out our first question.
Well, I'd like to ask Richard if he might start us off by defining transformative learning, both in its sort of conceptual sense and in its operational sense.
Sure. So first of all, thank you. It's just such a pleasure to be here. And thanks to Jennifer Hill and to Joan Clifford, David Malone, the Transformative Learning Intellectual Committee. I've had a few conversations with the committee. It's a committee, right? Or is it the group? Community of practice. It's been so energizing to have these conversations. I've been on a transformational learning journey myself for a number of years, but never really explored the theory behind it. And some of you may have actually experienced some sense of transformation and would define it in your own way. So I look forward to talking with you. Every time I have these conversations, I learn so much more about what I don't know. And so hopefully we'll have an opportunity to, even though I shouldn't say even though, we're in Zoom, could be a good thing. And it's an opportunity to connect, and that's a really good thing. And so I think we'll monitor the chat. So if you do have questions, pose them there. And if there's something that's not clear that I'm talking about, if I use certain language that comes from the field that doesn't make sense, please just throw it in the chat. And if somebody notices it in the chat, please say, hey, Richard, you just threw out a funky term, and someone's asking questions about that. Or if someone just has an idea that relates, please share. So again, thanks for being here. Hopefully you'll find this useful and there'll be some takeaways. And I just want to say also, I said this to the group, is I view this as an ongoing conversation. And so, this doesn't end. So if you have questions afterward, reach out to the group or email me directly at Cornell. Happy to respond. If you're interested in any of the citations I give or anything like that, or the resources, it's all about learning together. So, please reach out. It's something I'm very passionate about. So And so please don't hesitate to take that initiative. And if you come across resources and there's something you think I should be aware of, please send them to me as well. I also want to recognize one of my mentors in the group here, Dr. Bob Bringle, who's written extensively in the field of service learning and had a huge impact on me when I was a doctoral student and post-doctoral student. And he also was a reviewer of Engage Cornell in our early days. And so it's had just a tremendous impact on me and how we're thinking about this work at Cornell, because we do view Engage Cornell as a transformative approach to community engagement, which I hope we can touch upon a little bit down the road in this conversation. So thanks for showing up, Bob. It's great to see you again. Okay, so tough question, David. I'm going to pass that on to the group. Just kidding. So let me just tell you a quick story. I think it's important to start with stories, my own personal experience. Often we study what we've experienced. So I'll share two brief stories, and then I'll go into the more theory and operationalization, as David mentions, with transformational learning. So when I was 17, I got a Rotary scholarship to study in the northern part of Sweden, pre-internet, you know, like 1999. Just kidding. So it was a while back, and I lived in the bubble we call Ithaca bubble, 30,000 people in the small town. I grew up in Ithaca, and I hadn't been out of Ithaca. I'd only been to Canada. I hadn't been outside the U.S. Except for Canada, and so had this opportunity to go to Sweden. I spent a year in Sweden. I went to school. I learned Swedish, fell in love. Witnessed a friend, had a friend who died. So I never experienced death. Experienced love for the first time, and built some amazing friendships. Also lived in the north, about 60 kilometers below the Arctic Circle. So it was dark all the time during the winter, a lot of snow and a lot of ice, and it was sun all the time in the summer. I'm just setting you up because these were things that were very unfamiliar to me. Love, death, friendships with people who I didn't know, language, culture. I lived with a family, a couple of families. And man, was it intense. And I had so many jarring experiences of things that I had never witnessed before. So I had friends who I played hockey with, I played ice hockey with, and one of my friends said to me, "Richard, you have such beautiful blue eyes. I love your eyes." And I'm 17. In my high school, you didn't say that. Like as what it meant to be a male was not coming up to somebody and saying, "You have such beautiful eyes," particularly if you were heterosexual. And coming from a hockey player, I loved it. Actually, I loved when he asked me that question. And it was jarring. Another thing that I experienced there was, I used to ride a bike to school every day, and I never put a lock on my bike, ever. It was always there. It never got stolen. I didn't lock anything up in the locker rooms in the gym. And even just the language, the way in which the social relationships between people who are my age, there was sort of like a level of communication that I had never witnessed before. And when I came back to the United States, I started noticing things that were so different. But I didn't have any kind of a framework for processing the experience. Sort of these multiple forms of these incidents that I would experience that just weren't in my worldview. And it triggered in me sort of reflection on how people interact, the way in which men and women, relate to each other, how they talk about different subjects that might be taboo. The political and economic systems there, the cultural rituals, their norms. One time I came home and my father said, "Richard, I would like to dialogue with you." No adult had ever asked me to dialogue with them. I didn't even know how to respond to that. I didn't even know what he meant. And obviously, if you've read anything about transformational learning, dialogue is front and center in the theory. But he wanted to have this conversation. And I was used to parents telling me what to do or establishing guidelines and what I can and can't do. And he was like, well, I want to learn more about your school and your relationships, and let's have a dialogue. And so obviously I failed miserably at that because I hadn't been trained in how to have a dialogue or even enter that conversation. So fast forward, and that experience in Sweden, I just want to mention, is a marker in my journey as a person, and how I understand myself, my identity, and my view of the world. And so it's a permanent marker that etches how I see the world. And I often draw on my experience in Sweden when I think about how people interact, or there was very little violence that I witnessed in Sweden, and growing up playing 4 sports and seeing and having 4 brothers and being male and seeing a lot of fights. Never witnessed one in an entire year in Sweden. So it started shifting my whole understanding of what it means to be a male, and a level of sensitivity around that and femininity, even introducing that with my friends in sports, and the challenges with that, and how we related to others in a college setting when I came back. So fast forward, as a faculty member, I started taking students to Nicaragua in 1994. And prior to that, I taught overseas, mostly to adult populations. I taught political science, Spanish, a few other subjects. And it was the first time for me to take a group of students to Nicaragua. I didn't use the term service learning, but it was with a nursing professor, and we did health clinics. We worked at the hospital. We did workshops and hygiene and health practices, prevention practices. And I was a political scientist, so I hadn't been trained in a lot of the health prevention activities. I didn't know the field of nursing. And I partnered with this nursing professor. We brought students down to Nicaragua for 3 weeks in the North Atlantic coast, a place called Puerto Cabezas, and the Mosquito Coast, where there are a number of indigenous communities, there are Black Creole communities, and mestizos, or Spanish-speaking population. And an interesting area, the Atlantic coast, very different than the Pacific coast. And we gave the students readings, and we connected them with all sorts of community members. We had dialogues. We did some reflection, although I wasn't really well-versed in how to do reflection. But we had debriefs after dinner every day, talked about our day. We had students doing journals in the nursing program. There was a lot of journaling. So we had students doing journaling, but I hadn't been trained as an educator on how to even assess journals. Students kept a personal journal, and then a journal that was based on our discussions and readings and conversations with community partners and our service work. I came back to school with the students. This was 3 weeks. I think that experience in 3 weeks, and I had lived in Spain for 4 years, in Sweden and Mexico, Greece, for many, many months and for years. In those 3 weeks, my entire view of the world and my view as an educator shifted dramatically. It was life-changing. I didn't have a language for expressing it. I didn't know what transformational learning theory was. I didn't know what service learning theory or programs were all about. But I was a completely different person when I came back. And I had a very difficult time articulating what it meant to shift as an educator, as a person. And then lo and behold, my students were coming to me, and they were also telling me the same thing. I'm really grappling with that experience, and I'm just struggling to even tell you how much I've changed. And I see the world so differently. I see what I do in my lifestyle, my habits so differently. And so I didn't even feel prepared to have those conversations with my students. In some cases, I felt like I was engaging in therapy, and I didn't feel qualified, because what they were communicating to me was a lot of struggle. Like, I keep thinking about the children that we've worked with there. I keep thinking about the women that we worked with in the hospital and the conditions in Nicaragua. And I'm just struggling with how to process the entire experience. It's just changed the way I see my major and my program and my role in school and with my family. So they were really struggling, and they said, nobody really understands what this was all about. I don't know what to do next. So it begged a lot of questions for me about how well we were prepared, the kind of teaching and learning process, the pedagogy, the methods we were using. And so that kind of triggered in me an interest in studying transformational learning. So I share that with you because I really wanted to discover, what do we mean when we say we experienced something that was life-changing? What does transformation mean? What constitutes transformation? Are there any patterns for the way in which these students are experiencing the dramatic changes in the way they see themselves in the world based on that 3-week experience? Can that happen in 3 weeks? What are the factors and conditions, as David mentioned in the question, that influence, those enabling conditions that influence how people change? This is dramatically different than teaching in a classroom and a lecture. But I didn't understand those differences. I wanted to tease them out. And I wasn't sure that the kinds of things that they were saying were good. I wasn't sure if our program was a good thing. I was also asking myself questions about our commitment to our community partners in Nicaragua. And that was something, you know, what's my institution think? Came across a book by Bob Bringle about institutional transformation and institutions as citizens. Never thought about an institution as a citizen. It's the first time I ever thought about that. So thanks, Bob. Good opportunity to acknowledge that wonderful notebook that you created based on a series of conversations that you had like this. And so it's like, oh, I never thought about institutions as citizens. Huh, that's an interesting question. And what's my role in that? Am I a citizen of an institution that's a citizen? What does that mean? If I'm an educator, am I a citizen? What's my role? Should the Board of Trustees know about this and the conditions that we just witnessed? You know, should people outside of our institution know about this? So anyway, I had a lot of questions. So to get to David's point, I just wanted to share that I was very new to this conversation. And I came across, so I had an opportunity to do my doctorate at Cornell while I was running this program. It was cool because a lot of times you don't have an opportunity to be a practitioner and then also study theory and ask questions about what's happening in practice and take courses to better understand it and then apply it and then take it back to the classroom, right? So I had this really cool opportunity. I had all these questions. What's the pedagogy about? What does it mean to work with communities and build partnerships? What's the role of the institution? I was asking all those questions, and then I was taking classes at Cornell. And I got exposed to transformational learning and Jack Mesereau, who wrote a book on transformational learning in 1990 based on a number of studies that he had done at Columbia University, one with Victoria Marsick, another scholar in the field. And his first study had to do with examining what was happening to women who were re-entering a community college and going back to school. And they were noticing that they started reflecting on their identity and how it was defined and who was defining it and whether or not their identity was more than homemaker and whether or not there were other ways of thinking about their roles. And they were having conversations and observing people, other women that were doing things that they didn't even know they had access to. And so Mesereau and Victoria Marsick started studying, are there patterns to this shift in roles? Is there a particular process that's happening when someone re-examines their identity? And then is there something that's social about that as well? Is it not just individual, but also social and institutional? So he came up with this process. And what's interesting is he drew from a number of other learning theories. And I just want to quote something for you that's in a really cool handbook. If you haven't seen it, it's 2009. It's the Handbook on Transformational Learning. So a lot of cool chapters in here. I'd encourage you to check it out. It's pretty updated in terms of the theory and studies that have been done. But there's a quote. It's one of his last chapters, I think, that he wrote before he died. And he's no longer with us. I actually got a chance to meet him. He came to Cornell a bunch of times. He looks like Spock in Star Trek. And I think his brain is that big. I mean, he created this grand theory called transformational learning, which is the most important adult learning theory in the past 5 decades now. So it hasn't ended as the most prominent adult learning theory. So he wrote in his chapter right from the beginning that the human condition may be best understood as a continuous effort to negotiate contested meanings. So for Mesereau, learning and adult learning in particular, young adult learning as well, is about meaning making, making sense of the world. And so when he started crafting transformational learning theory, the notion that learning is about meaning making means that critical reflection and assumptions and dialogue to validate meaning are central to the transformational learning process. So what Mezirow conceived as a meaning perspective or a frame of reference or a worldview, he uses meaning perspective in his earlier work and a frame of reference in his later work, is something that constitutes this. We have this worldview that shapes and limits the way that we perceive the world and make meaning of our experience. Hopefully everybody understands that. So that we have a worldview that both shapes and limits it. We don't have an all perspectival view. We all have a unique way of experiencing the world and making meaning of the world. And so it's like a double-edged sword. We can't completely know a phenomenon or completely have all the angles or lenses to a particular experience. We can all witness something in Nicaragua, but we might interpret that experience in a very different way. So for him, when you talk about transformation or learning, it's fundamentally about meaning making. So another thing to notice in his theory is transformation. I know there's a question about what transformation is not, but transformation is, it's fundamentally, it's a profound change in the way that we see ourselves in the world. It's like a metamorphosis. So what emerges after an experience is we're fundamentally different than before. So everything we say, it's everything we think, and how we act, our values and our beliefs. It's like putting on glasses, colored glasses, and we see the world completely differently. So that's another thing to think about is, and there's no final stage. What Mezirow always argued is you can't tell somebody, you can't predetermine transformation, right? If you predetermine transformation, then it's tantamount to indoctrination. And that's a direct quote from Mezirow. That the best we can do is, as we experience the world and we start critically examining our assumptions and the validity of our assumptions and the distortions of our assumptions, those limiting dimensions of our assumptions, to guide how we act in meaningful ways with the world and with others, the best we can do is come up with our best tentative judgment. So the end form, what transforms, can't be predetermined, and it's always evolving, right? We live in a dynamic state. It's not static. So we're always learning. And I think that's really important because people talk about transformation as if it's an endpoint. And if there's a takeaway from this session is we're always cultivating critical reflection and dialogue and learning from others and learning about our own assumptions and how we're making sense of the world, making meaning of the world, so that it's constantly evolving depending on the context we're in. So that's important as well to understand. I think the last thing I'll say is, and this isn't attributed to anybody, transformational learning is ultimately, it's in the eye of the beholder. It also depends on one's readiness for change and openness to change, the way in which we interpret and attach meaning to our experiences are individual constructions, right? So it's a deeper, more profound shift in our worldview. It's a new lens from which we see certain aspects of our life and our identity and others with less distortion, less blurriness, greater clarity. It's a higher level of consciousness. I'm throwing these things out because there's various interpretations of transformation. It also influences the way we learn, act, and interact with others and behave differently depending on our revised way of seeing the world, personally, interpersonally, at work, in society. The other thing that Mezirow did is he noticed phases in transformation. And some of you may have been exposed to this, but he identified 10 sort of patterned phases. So he talked about, and this is our next question, but I'll mention it here, is we talked about a disorienting dilemma. There's always a trigger, a catalyst, a critical incident, a crisis, something that happens that's like it creates a sort of a disjuncture, it disorients us because it's not in our familiar, it's not familiar to us. It's not in our frame of reference. So some of the examples I gave about Nicaragua and Sweden, it's something that causes us to think about like, wow, that's different. I haven't ever noticed that before, but it could be traumatic or incremental. but it's an anomaly in the way we see the world or ourselves or others. It's like, it makes us question our assumptions about my example about maleness. Like, wow, they're acting very differently than the males I know. Why is that? And does that beg questions about the way in which I see myself as a male? And what do I do about that? Is that a better way to act? And is that a more authentic way of being who you are? And so I started questioning my own interpretation of what it means to be male. So this self-examination he talks about is another step. Often when we experience these just junctures or dissonance, we start to feel emotions. So think about when someone questions, when you see something that questions the way you see the world, that makes you question the way you see the world, sometimes you feel defensive. So if somebody points something out, like when I was in Sweden or Nicaragua, sometimes people were a little bit belligerent with me, and they attached my identity. While I didn't know this, they would say, "You Americans," and I'd think, what do they mean by "you Americans" or an American? I don't even know what that means to me. And Americans are very different. There are a lot of Americans in lots of different places in the United States. So I don't think we have one conception of what an American is. And so it begged a lot of questions for me, but also it made me feel somewhat defensive or guilty that I didn't know a lot about what they knew about Americans.
Richard, can I interrupt for a moment?
Yeah.
This is such an interesting train of thought, and we have some students weighing in with questions. Perhaps Joan could blend and interpret these questions for the group. Meanwhile, we're going to put up another poll question for everyone to consider during that next part of the conversation. Joan?
Well, there are some questions about how to ready ourselves for transformation, how to open ourselves up for the transformative learning. And do we consciously enter into transformative learning, or is it only realized upon reflection? So that's the direction of the current questions.
Those are great questions. And we'll post the results of the poll in a moment after Richard's had a chance to consider.
Yeah, so two really good questions. So one about readiness for change, or readiness for transformation. So one of the things that it's talked about in the literature, at least, and what I've observed over the years in trying to facilitate transformational learning is if people are not willing to critique their assumptions, then it's hard to engage in a re-examine of your assumptions and shift your perception on a particular topic or an issue or your own identity. And so in an educational space, what's nice is you can create the conditions for practicing critical reflection. Raise your hand, and I think you can do that here, is, have you ever had a class in critical reflection? It's called Cultivating Critical Reflection or Engaging in Critical Reflection, and even add dialogue to that. Yeah, so it begs the question in our higher education settings, two fundamental processes, critical reflection and dialogue, right? So critical reflection on our own assumptions. So don't start with a text, but the text is your own assumptions, right? And what do you think about this aspect of the world? What are the preconceived ideas that you have, presuppositions that you might have about a topic or an issue? And are you willing to be open-minded for questioning your own assumptions about your behaviors or your assumptions? And it's really hard to do that with your own set of assumptions, right? We're somewhat biased with ourselves. It's hard to check ourselves with ourselves. So that's the dialogue piece. And so part of readiness for change is being open-minded, permeable, discriminating. These are terms, inclusive, that Mesereau used, this idea of your willingness to absorb new information, right? To take the perspective of somebody else, not debate, but understand the perspective, to truly listen. These are skill sets, to listen eloquently. These are skill sets that I think we don't have a lot of training in, to be an astute observer. So in the service learning field, there's fantastic frameworks for doing that, that can kind of help you if you're open to and ready for engaging in transformational learning, critical reflection. So one that Bob will be familiar with, and you might be, is the what, so what, now what. Another is the deal model, describe, examine, and articulate learning. And they have sets of criteria. So what does it mean to describe the way in which you've experienced the world, or a particular setting or context or an experience or a situation? And think about it. How many of you have had classes in ethnography of going into a particular situation and just putting all your senses in high alert and learning how to listen to what people are saying? So you go into a context in service learning, you come back, you should have a few quotes. That would say, oh, I listened to the community partners and here's what they said. So that's in the inclusiveness of valuing that knowledge comes from a variety of different places. So that readiness is to see knowledge and the sources of knowledge in so many different forms and places. So readiness means a recognition of that, of seeing knowledge, understanding that in higher ed, it's about knowledge making, right? Knowledge generation and application. But how many of us get into conversations about what knowledge is, where it comes from, who generates it, how it is applied, who benefits, who doesn't benefit, who's at the table when we are generating knowledge? Do you even have access to the creation of knowledge? So the first thing that I do to help people become ready for change when I teach classes is I'll say to the students that I'm with, how many of you can memorize things? Everyone raises their hand, right? How many of you can memorize things, write them down, take a test, and do pretty well? Well, you're at Duke. Cornell students, IUPY, where Bob was, Appalachian State, they're smart. You guys are the experts at memorization. My goodness, my daughters know how to memorize more than I do, and they're 10 and 15. I forget everything after this. Like, my memory fades. So I'll say, how many of you have ideas? Let's explore the ideas you have for generating the knowledge that you have, that you've come to the classroom with, and that can be our text. And that's jarring, that's dissonant, right? That's unfamiliar. And so that's a way for me to say, let's get out of our typical worldview and the norms and rituals we engage in higher ed, because I don't want to dumb you down by asking you to recall and memorize things. That's dumbing you down. And I don't care if you're a freshman or a senior, we're not going to do that. We're going to do much more in advanced conceptual thinking and dig into concepts, explore and examine and evaluate even how we think about knowledge, right? I'm going to invite you into that conversation.
Richard, you know, that sounds really aspirational, but in practice, I bet a lot of faculty would be uncertain how to do that. I'm going to ask Alessandra to share the poll results now. And half of our participants say, you know, this is the possibility of transformation is desirable, aspirational, but when convenient. Students are primarily focused on the academic and professional success. They're open to expanded perspectives when the opportunity is convenient. That's where the majority of our participants here today, and that's probably true of Duke students overall. So my question perhaps to you, Richard, and I know David wants to jump in with a question too. What are the barriers to shifting those frames of reference, shifting, I guess, those tendencies, that culture at a place like Duke or at a place like Cornell or elsewhere?
It's a great question. So when we haven't been exposed to theories and practices around critical reflection and dialogue, it can be very intimidating. And we start to recognize that there are norms and practices that actually don't facilitate critical reflection and dialogue. Because if we're questioning sort of the status quo, it's almost like committing cultural suicide, right? You know, what I was finding when students came back from Nicaragua and the studies that I've done around this is that transformational learning is fundamentally critiquing the norms and the institutions and the culture, and if they are causing harm, if there are things that you're witnessing that aren't helpful. So if the structure of the classroom is oppressive, how do you challenge that? And how do you do it in a way that the receiver of that information, it doesn't feel defensive, doesn't have those emotions, doesn't want to talk about it? And so one challenge is just learning how to to share the sort of your way of seeing the world, so that it's received and it doesn't cause someone to be defensive. So one of the barriers is just, your own kind of self-comfort with engaging in those practices when people that you're talking to don't see the world in that way. They don't necessarily have those glasses on. And so part of it is preparing for that, and then anticipating why someone, your peers, instructor, staff member, might not be able to see the world in the same way that you do, because you're somewhat outside the fishbowl now, and you're examining it from outside the fishbowl, and you're asking somebody within the fishbowl that hasn't had an opportunity to get outside the fishbowl, if I could use that metaphor. And so it's like growing legs as a fish, jumping out, growing legs, and then stepping back in, and you're totally different. And everybody's looking at you like, come on, why are you questioning everything? Why are you challenging everything? And people don't even notice how there are certain practices that are harmful. So I think one of the barriers is just, it's sort of an interpersonal and a self barrier, but there's also institutional barriers. So classrooms weren't necessarily set up to engage in critical reflection or dialogue. So then it's, how do you then have conversations with and work with others to re-examine the way in which classes are taught, to allow for more opportunities for critical reflection and dialogue. So, and that has to do with, negotiating power. And that's one of the dimensions of critical reflection. So when you put these glasses on and you start to notice that certain people have power in terms of determining the curriculum and the coursework and what we study and what we don't study, then part of it is thinking about how do we shift the relations of power so that we do have a greater voice. And so, some ways of doing that is building a coalition, looking for other peers that are willing to work with you to shape alternatives in the curriculum. At Cornell, we have intergroup dialogue, which is a newish program that exposes students to how to engage in meaningful dialogue with people who have different perspectives and different backgrounds. So, but that's a new program that was introduced. So, and certainly service learning is also something that's a little bit counter-normative as well. And so part of it is building some trust, that people are willing to listen to you and feel comfortable. So building relational trust can be helpful as well to overcome some barriers. I've found the more trust you have with somebody, the more you can be candid, particularly if you're critiquing a particular norm or practice.
Richard, let me jump in. I've got about 1,000 questions, and I really appreciate your energy, and I really appreciate the depth of thought that you're bringing to this. And it makes me realize how much work we have here to do at our university, because transformative learning isn't normative. Now, I want to ask Ethan and Cole if they are comfortable just unmuting and just ask your questions, because I think they're so important and we need to address them.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think our questions are along a similar vein, but I'll read mine and then Hassan can hop on and read hers. So my question was just, how do you feel that privilege plays a role in transformative learning, or does it play a role?
And Ethan, do you want to?
Yeah, I can hop on as well. I wrote that who sits at the table and who benefits from transformative learning seems to be skewed to those who have access to resources. What would this look like for those who don't have these spaces?
Wow. I always leave it to students to ask the provocative questions. It's sort of like, I want to almost turn it back to you and say, help me answer that question. So the privilege question is really interesting, and it gets to what David was saying earlier about, you look at brochures and marketing and the 4 goals of the strategic plan. And yet when you ask someone what transformation means and what it means to do transformative work, they may not even draw from any of the 4 or 5 decades of theory and research that's been done in this area, or they might not mention, well, it's really important to do critical reflection. And it's important to understand what it means to do reflection and what happens when you modify reflection with critical. And so that's just one thing to put out there. While it's, is it a conversation of the privilege? That's interesting. So if we're talking about higher education, so it depends on sort of what, how you want to enter into that conversation. So one example of this is when I was at the University of Georgia, I sat on 2 committees. One committee was a diversity committee, and I sat on another committee that I had formed through a grant that I got to work with undocumented immigrants and immigrant communities, people who had very, very limited resources. The diversity committee was interested in boosting the percentage of students from diverse backgrounds that had the resources to go to the University of Georgia. The other, who would perhaps have an opportunity to engage in deeper types of learning in the courses that they would take and the curriculums that they would be part of, the curricula they'd be part of. The committee I was on that caused me a little bit of dissonance that didn't ever come up in the diversity committee was I was working with people who not only were low income, some of whom were undocumented, but people in the state referred to them largely as illegal aliens, so not even human beings. And so the research I was doing was trying to articulate the experience and represent the experience, which is a hard thing to do, of the people I was interviewing and doing focus groups with in Georgia over a 4-year period. And part of that was to influence policies that were being constructed that put up barriers for people who could not, didn't have the resources to study at the University of Georgia. So I was on these 2 committees, and I was positionality-wise, I was a faculty member at the University of Georgia. I was having a really difficult time reconciling these 2 committees. Yes, the diversity committee was really important, but how would I bring in that conversation to the diversity committee? Would they be willing to create greater access and equity and start thinking about equity for these other populations, these groups that didn't have access to the University of Georgia? And so that was a really uncomfortable situation that I was in, because I didn't want to, like what I was talking about before, I didn't want to come across as challenging my colleagues who were actually doing a good thing sitting on the diversity committee. And so that's just an example in my own position of trying to advocate for equity for people that don't have access to conversations in higher ed that would engage in perhaps critical reflection and dialogue. The other thing I'll say, so that's just one example that doesn't necessarily fit your question, but I just want to share that with you. But as a student, the experience that I had in Nicaragua, we would do these pre-post surveys, and we would ask students to define their socioeconomic status. And a number of students would define themselves as below the poverty line. So the students that were engaging in critical reflection and dialogue in our courses and in Nicaragua with community members came back from Nicaragua redefining their socioeconomic status based on a different positionality, a different context. So after going to Nicaragua and seeing that there was 90% unemployment, very little access to healthcare, no clean water, very few schools, no higher ed, they came back and they saw themselves as highly privileged based on comparing with folks in Nicaragua. So they were engaging in critical reflection and dialogue, but it wasn't a privileged opportunity. And I think the last thing I'll say is nobody's immune to critically examining their assumptions at any time. You don't need to be in higher ed to do that. Of course, higher ed is a space to promote that, but all of us have distorted assumptions. No one is above or privileged in terms of their consciousness, right? So we all bring a consciousness to the table. Some of us aren't at the table, but when we do come to the table, whatever table that might be, we have a consciousness, we have a set of assumptions that we may have critically examined or not for their validity. And so that's just a really important way of thinking about access to transformational learning. Is it starts with your own sets of assumptions. So for me, it's about how do you create spaces for examining your assumptions, for engaging in dialogue, no matter where you are on the privilege spectrum. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'd love to hear what students think about that, because I'm not sure that that gets at what you're saying. You know, David mentioned Paulo Freire early on, but Paulo Freire also worked on transformational learning, but it wasn't just about individuals transforming their perspective. And he worked with resource limited communities in Brazil. And part of it was helping them develop critical consciousness to challenge the system that in which they were oppressed. And so the origins, or the women that Mesereau worked with, the origins of transformational learning theory actually were with people who didn't have access to resources, who were often didn't have that privilege. And so it is interesting how higher ed has sort of shifted the way we see who has access to these kinds of conversations.
Let me invite the students to respond to what you said, and invite Liliana and Patty Clayton to respond to what you said.
Oh, is Patty here?
Yeah,
Hi.
Patty's here.
Hi, Patty. I don't see you in the big group, but thanks for showing up.
Well, students, how would you respond to that answer? Isant, is that satisfactory? Or is transformative learning still a pedagogy of privilege?
I might sound very cynical in this, but I really do feel like it has a lot of privilege. As Professor Kiely was talking, I couldn't help but think that I'm being able to be exposed to this and these ideas because I am a Duke student, and because I am privileged in that regard. I grew up in Jamaica. I moved to the US when I was 14, and I think about kind of the education that I received there. And without that education, I definitely would not have been at Duke. But I think about how we talk about kind of that transformation that happens when you kind of experience something that you're not used to, and you kind of change your whole worldview, and how students there don't get those same opportunities for a myriad of reasons, but just kind of how, so yeah, trying to work through my thoughts, but not very satisfied. But I mean, I understand that it's like a working theory, and this is something that like has to keep, as Professor Kiely said, this is an ongoing conversation. This is something that will keep being learned about and discovered, but yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. David, I just want to say one more thing before Patty and others step in, and I'm very interested in that. In adult education, so a couple things. Learning spaces can be anywhere, right? So we're talking about higher education and who has access to higher education, and how transformational learning might occur in higher education settings, a place like Duke or Cornell, or where I taught originally in a community college, or in Spain when I taught in different organizations and neighborhoods. In adult ed, we talk about 3 different educational spaces: informal, non-formal, and formal. Higher ed being a formal educational space. So critical reflection and dialogue happens in informal conversations that you might have with your peers in the cafeteria, or outside at a cafe, or with your family, or at home in Jamaica. Non-formal could be organizations that provide services, educational services, literacy services. So there are critical literacy programs, which Freire was working with in Brazil and other places. And so there are lots of different spaces where critical reflection and dialogue, in order to change the world so that it's less harmful and more empowering and less oppressive, happens in these different spaces. So I suppose it depends on the context. The last thing I'll say is, and part of the conversation today, which we really haven't hit on, is my work is in community engaged learning, which questions the norms in higher ed and how they do teaching and learning, how the institution is structured, right? The organization is set up, who defines the curriculum, how research is conducted, and how we partner with communities. Those 4 buckets: teaching and learning, the organization, research, and community partners. And so in any of one of those spaces, critical reflection and dialogue can occur. But in higher ed, what service learning does is it questions the intersections between how we think about teaching and learning. So if we're going out in the community, then there should be more access to community partners. But it means we have to change the way the institution is structured and critically examine the way the institution is structured. So is a curriculum allowing us to do that? Do we allocate resources to do that? You know, do we think about our endowments? Do we think about equity and access? who has a voice or doesn't. And then it's fundamentally about how we see knowledge. So, so where does knowledge come from? Who does it benefit? Who generates it? And then in terms of community partnerships, how do we build capacity in communities? So if you take a service learning lens or a community engaged learning lens, the whole goal of that is to open up spaces, educational spaces in higher ed or in K through 12 settings, right? For conversations that allow more people to be involved in critical reflection and dialogue. So it isn't just a privileged space. And also, higher education isn't just a place where privileged study, right? There are lots of different kinds of higher education institutions with people with all sorts of backgrounds and levels of resources. But what I'm talking about is shifting the way we see through critical reflection, those 4 areas. So I just want to throw that out there for you to think about also when you're thinking about whether or not it's a privileged activity. It depends on the context and the space that you're in. Okay, so just to put that out there, welcome any comments, or Patty or whoever else wanted to talk, any of the students that are out there, or faculty or staff.
Yeah, Liliana or Patty, would you like to comment based on your questions?
So this is Patty. One of the things I am thinking is actually what Deb and Dennis just gave voice to in the chat. So I'd actually prefer to, what do they do in Congress? Cede my time to Deb if she wants to.
Come on, Patty.
Say that same thought I had. Deb, do you want to?
There's Deb. Oh, she's now inviting you.
So Deb wrote in the chat about the same time I was thinking of it.
Oh, okay.
Raised the question about sort of the flip side of this, that are there ways in which privilege can get in the way of the openness to transformational learning? Privilege can blind you to, and Deb, I'm putting some words in your mouth here, so flag it down and say, no, that's not what I meant. But she said, if anything, privilege can get in the way of this. Again, that's one of the things I was thinking about. We've also, so Richard's holding up another book there, Pedagogies for the Non-Poor.
Yep. Paulo Freire has a chapter in here. What do you do with people with privilege who live inside a cocoon of privilege? What happens when you develop their critical consciousness? So it's a fascinating book. One of the first books I read before doing my dissertation. Very interesting. So it's interesting to juxtapose that with Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So it was specifically written for that manner of what do you do with privilege and how do you develop critical consciousness to break into that cocoon. Anyway.
And I think we're seeing in the chat, Deb and Dennis, I tossed in something, Melissa, that question of privilege, you can unpack it lots of different ways. And in some ways it might serve, it might lend itself to being in spaces in which critical reflection, critical meaning making is evoked. And in some ways it might get in the way of that. So I really appreciate that problematizing of that relationship. The other thing I was going to throw in terms of access to resources being a variable here is, I remember being struck probably 15 years ago when I did a wee little bit of work with K-12 instructors.
Yeah.
Elementary school, even that young.
Yep.
They were, I was sharing some stuff we were doing around critical thinking and asking why and challenging your assumptions and taking multiple perspectives. And they said, yeah, we're doing that in, 3rd grade. So at least in this country where a K-12 education is a public right, then in principle, at least, access to that sort of exposure, that context for exposure to some of these ideas would not depend on going to higher ed. So I think that's encouraging.
Yeah, the one thing, thank you, Patty, and thanks for all the other questions and comments and ideas. The privilege is really interesting. So some of you, what I argue for at Cornell is sort of, I keep arguing for resources to be devoted for preparatory classes so that no one can escape some of these learning processes that get at transformational learning. And so, there's a lot of pushback, again, because this approach is counter-normative, I get a lot of pushback. So what did I do? As an agent of change, I created courses and taught them in colleges. Didn't matter what the college. And what I'm going to mention here is what would go into a preparation course to ensure that transformational learning isn't just for the privileged. And so if anybody's interested in that, I can share the course and materials. But what we do is it's a series of dissonant experiences that get us to question our assumptions, one of which might be privilege. And so one of the activities that we do in the session is, and some of you might have done that, is Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking Your Privileged Knapsack. I don't know if people are familiar with that. So as a white male who came from a middle-class background, I've done it outside, shouting the different steps. And it basically makes statements, and then you step forward or backward, depending on your level of privilege. And it can physically juxtapose you based on these dimensions of privilege in the knapsack that Peggy McIntosh created. And I'm literally screaming hundreds of yards away if I do it outside. I'm like, hi. And part of it is modeling my comfort level with discomfort, which is incredibly important, right? So it's a preparatory course because I don't assume that people have that most people have these skill sets to get outside their comfort zone and start to examine their assumptions and question their privilege. And so to get at the privilege question, also there are activities that you can do around positionality or privilege that get at that. And so I would recommend that. I also saw Peggy McIntosh speak. Just an amazing person. And she talked about when she developed as a faculty member, as a woman who was surrounded by men, started questioning who has privilege. And every night she said she got up and put another facet into her knapsack, another privilege into her knapsack. And her husband kept saying, why do you keep getting up in the middle of the night? And so just hearing her describe how she created the knapsack was fascinating. It was a wonderful presentation. But, you know, there's somebody that's mentored me from afar to see her and then to see why she created the knapsack and what its purpose was. And even she was questioning her privilege. She was questioning the privilege of men, but also then started questioning her privilege as a white woman. And so it was just a fascinating presentation that she gave. But I don't want to lose that privilege conversation because it's key, but I think it has to do with what are the activities that we're engaging in to help people unpack their privilege. But I wouldn't want to exclude anybody from that conversation.
Richard, if we could take the notion of privilege to a new level, and that is to acknowledge systemic racism. And one question we thought about prior to today's meeting was, as educators, teachers, learners, members of a learning community, we acknowledge that systemic racism is deeply woven into the fabric of American history and our institutions, law, politics, pretty much every part of public life. So from your perspective, what are the intersections then between critical reflection, critical race theory, and transformative learning? Is there anything, how can these perspectives on transformative learning enhance and kind of develop those understandings?
Yeah, that's a pretty deep question, right? We're grappling with that as a globe. I think the two things that I think about in terms of the intersection, they lead me to think about two things, and some things I've been experimenting with this semester and in the past, but really focused this semester given the anti-racist efforts as one form of oppression, a dimension of oppression. And that is cultural humility. I think cultural humility is a really important concept and way of being. And there are theories out there of cultural humility. In our most recent book, we have a whole chapter devoted to cultural humility. And we argue there are three facets to cultural humility. So self-reflection and the ability to sort of be sensitive to diverse people with diverse backgrounds and perspectives and adapt to other cultures and places, get outside your comfort zone and get a comfort level with that adaptation. But it's also, another dimension is comfort level with resistance, resisting norms and institutions and policies that have been historically created that by dominant groups that disadvantage some groups and advantage others. And so through self-reflection and through critical reflection with others, getting at why, what are those, what are the factors that influence those norms and institutions and policies and practices, and then how do we as agents of change change them so that they're less oppressive, less harmful, that they benefit people, they lead to greater equity. So those are two dimensions of cultural humility. And then the third one is sort of similar. So it's this idea of adaptation, resistance, understanding relations of power and shifting those, and then holding institutions accountable. Like, how do we hold our institutions accountable? And you know, that's a really hard thing to do, right? I mean, again, how are we trained to do that? Is it just about protests? Are there more? Like, what happens after the protest that raises consciousness and starts to hold people accountable? But then things need to change: the way in which resources are allocated, the way in which policies have been created, the ways in which institutions are funded, so or supported. You know, how are we thinking about it in curriculum in schools? How are we thinking about it in our own institutions in higher ed? And so that's also an important part of a dimension of cultural humility. So it isn't just coming into a space being sensitive, but it's also thinking of yourself as a change agent and a willingness to engage. There's a really cool tool that I'm sure Bob and Patty are familiar with, and maybe the group here. It's through Campus Compact in Minnesota. They recently updated their social change wheel. It's a really cool wheel that has different ways that you can engage in change making, and protest is one of them, but there are a variety of other actions you can take. And I recently, in this preparatory course that I created with a group of freshmen, I've done this twice now with freshmen at Cornell in 2 different places, exposing them to the social change wheel, and then having a conversation about, what did you do when you were in high school? What kind of change making did you engage in high school? And then now observing the social change wheel and all the different options of change making, what are some things that you might be able to do, and what might be challenging based on that? What are the different kinds of challenges? And then there's a really cool article that I use as a complement to that by Joseph Kahn and Joel Westheimer, What Constitutes or What is a Good Citizen? And I'm sure folks in the room are familiar with that, but they present 3 types of good citizens: a personally responsible citizen, a participatory citizen, and a justice-oriented citizen. And it's fascinating to expose, to think about and reflect on, what is my role as a citizen? And what constitutes a good citizen? And each of those kinds of citizens engage in different kinds of change making. Some are a little more passive and some are a little more active. As students look at justice-oriented citizen, well, the study that Kahn and Westheimer did is they found that when they looked at service learning programs in high schools, they found that a lot of high schools' service learning programs promoted the first type, a personally responsible citizen who obeys the law, who volunteers, who donates blood, and so on. Not so much a little bit more participatory citizen, so the person that organized the blood drive, who does the fundraiser, who brings people together. It's a different kind of citizen, a little more active, and focuses on the problem in a little bit different way, right? So it's not just about voting, which is really important. Don't get me wrong, it's really important. But then what's after that? What comes before the voting? Who organizes voter registration? Who's doing that work? Who's organizing people to make sure people get out to vote? And then the justice-oriented citizen will ask the question, yeah, but voting's not enough. Because then we got to hold people accountable once they get elected. And we have to legislate things that provide greater equity. So who's doing that work? We need to question current legislation and policies, but that's going to take a lot of work and a number of years. And it's a different kind of commitment, right? So imagine being exposed to the social change wheel and then reflecting on your role as a citizen and seeing all these different ways that you can engage in change making, and then questioning, like, look, I'm only 18 years old. Come on. Like, I don't know if I can commit to this. And then in my study in Nicaragua, which is an 8-year study, people said, wow, life got in the way. I had a covenant. I was going to change things. And then I got married and I had 3 kids and my job was crazy. I had 5 different jobs and I couldn't accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. And so why not start, as Patty says, literally when they're kids in elementary school? How far back when someone talked about, can we do transformational learning? Yes. In elementary school, why don't we want kids? My 10-year-old critically reflects on what it means to wear a mask. And she has the courage to question other kids like her, and she literally has statistics ready to her avail to tell them why it's important to wear a mask and social distance. She's 10. Now, I don't know if that has anything to do with me being her parent, but I think it has a lot to do with her gumption. She has such confidence, and so she models it for her peers. So it's really interesting to see. So anyway, I'm kind of rambly a bit, but just to say that preparation is so important, and then to invite people to think about what it means to be a change maker, but not overwhelm them, because that's too disruptive, I've found over the years. That start, invite people into critically examining their assumptions, help them kind of develop comfort with being a little bit outside their comfort zone, to take some risks, because you don't know the level of risk. It might be that, yeah, I'm comfortable being a personally responsible citizen, and I think I can step out of my comfort zone and be a little bit more participatory at this stage in my life. And to be realistic about how change happens and how much work it takes, that you can't do it alone. You have to organize others. So step back and ask yourself, who's teaching those kinds of classes? And here's one for you. Should students be teaching those kinds of classes?
Heck,
right?
yeah. Yes, they should.
Exactly. So big takeaway coming out of this is go out there and start to challenge whether or not you have and you're empowered to teach classes in this area. And
Richard, I'm going to interrupt with our last polling question, because I think it follows in that vein of what we think Duke ought to be. So Alessandra, could you trigger that? Thank you. And then we'll continue on with this question and Kira's enthusiastic nodding in response.
I've gotta say something.
Well, go ahead, David, while we're voting.
Okay, here we go. I really liked your question, Jennifer, about the kind of intersection of race, privilege, and transformative learning. Now, one thing that Liliana Paredes has taught me is that often I have used the other living in communities in Durham as a mechanism for triggering disorientation. Now, Richard, you went to Nicaragua, and that for you was a triggering moment. But again, in some ways, I mean, in many ways, that was, quote, the other for you. So this notion of privilege, and I think one of the reasons that resonates with our students is that, particularly in institutions of higher education, and I really do appreciate your point about learning occurring in all these spheres, and we're focusing only on one sphere. But at institutions like Duke and Cornell, like Duke creates a program called Duke Engage, and in the Duke Service Learning Program, it's often the use of the other as a means of triggering consciousness development. Now, in my own teaching, I've been criticized by students. And they say that I teach my classes aimed at the transformative learning of my white students, often in ways that are hurtful to students of color. And so that's something I have to own up to and take very seriously. And Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's one of Duke's most prestigious professors, said this summer that he no longer could teach classes in which yet another white woman would begin crying because she was experiencing transformation, because it wasn't fair or just to all students in the class. I just think we need to think about the ways in which institutions of higher education structure and position transformative learning, often at the expense of some communities and groups of people. And I would like to invite Liliana to share a thought.
Before we do that, Alessandra, could you share the results for us?
Oh.
That were kind of split. Just under half feel like the transformative learning is or should be an essential part of our student experience here. And about the same number say it's desirable and we should work towards it when possible. Liliana, your turn.
Oh, Thank you, David, for putting me in the spot. I mean, but I think I appreciate the direction of the conversation, because I also think about Duke University, and I teach in Duke University, and that's a question that I have all the time, you know, like, how am I using what we call the community to trigger the reflection on the students, you know, and even though we want as instructors to incorporate the experience in such a way that the organizations that we're working on benefit in one way or another, we're still in the process of using them for that purpose. And we come back to Duke and we write the final paper, we write the op-ed, and then the semester is over. And very little times there is a follow-up. And I have not read all of Freire's work, but I'm wondering, you know, the reinterpretation of Freire in the United States for higher education, and how we are talking about the transformative learning or transformation experience in a context where we're looking at our students, but not necessarily at the students without, or students who are in more vulnerable situations. Like how does transformation looks like in a student who comes from in our institution from vulnerable places, you know, like a student of color, or a student, an international student, and how do we present to them this notion of cultural humility, you know, and those are questions that I still have as an instructor, but also when we discuss what we want for Duke and for our Duke students. And those are my questions at this very moment, and I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thanks, Liliana. I really appreciate that. If there's one sort of message that I want to convey is doing this work with community and trying to change a higher education institution that's privileged in and of itself, has tremendous resources, gigantic endowment, is a significant responsibility. So I'm very, very sensitive to the facilitation of transformational learning and who's in the room and who's not. So what I struggle with is not only my own identity and constantly reflecting on that in different contexts and how I'm perceived and interpreted, and how I model or not facilitation of this type of work. But I've spent many, many, many years developing a, sorry, my dog is here, developing a, welcome to Zoom, a developmental approach to this work that doesn't use community as a prop for transformation. So what I've learned over the years is in classes, in classrooms, is that there are ways that you can create an educational space that causes some level of dissonance. And there are things like the privilege knapsack or the development of ground tools to create I use this term climatization or climatization, to set the climate with students. So immediately I start to model the negotiation of power, because I don't want to talk about the theory around power, but I want to talk about what it looks like to navigate power real time, and then invite in a very careful way with exercises. I do a lot of think, pair, shares. So it's students, and at the end of every class, I always feel my criteria for success is that we've collectively created knowledge and shared ideas that will be used not only in the next class, but by the next group of students that come into that class. So there's all sorts of ways to disrupt norms within the institution. But now that I'm in a different position with Engage Cornell that has a significant amount of resources, the level of responsibility, it compelled me to think about not just pedagogy and not just teaching and learning, but it compelled me to think about those 4 buckets. That is, what's my positionality in the classroom and in the curriculum and the way in which I teach and learn and what I'm supporting or not that gets at equity, inclusion, and anti-oppression work? How am I thinking about the linkage to the institution, which compels a lot of people to teach in particular ways where it's fixed, that wasn't necessarily set up to invite community members into the development of that curriculum, right? So the first course I taught in Nicaragua, I went to Nicaragua, and then I created a syllabus based on those conversations, and I co-taught the course with Nicaraguans. And I invited community members to be part of that course. So why would I teach the history of the Atlantic Coast when there's a local historian? That makes no sense to me. So we had doctors come in and nurses. We had young youth facilitate dialogue in different neighborhoods. So we used local language. So there's all sorts of ways to do that. And I remember when I presented the course to the curriculum committee, it was fascinating. The only question they had was, I don't see you're meeting our math distribution requirements. And then someone raised their hand and said, have you ever tried to change money in Italian? Like the lira, it's crazy. And then they passed the course. But in some ways I had to be covert about the fact that I was co-teaching it with Nicaraguans. I didn't put that in the syllabus, just putting that out there. I know this is being recorded, but it's dangerous to do this work. I mean, so there's always a level of risk taking, even in the classroom. I can't assume that faculty members are comfortable with negotiating power, or if they're going to do service learning, they're going to invite community members to help create that syllabus and develop a partnership agreement. So there are all sorts of tools in the classroom and working with the institution, and then thinking about research and helping people think about what would it look like to do a decolonizing approach to research, right? That's a very different question than how do I, teach the standard IRB method and have people take the test, which is important, right? But to then really think about, what does a decolonizing strategy look like? And how are we incorporating the methodology of decolonize colonial practices? That questions the entire structure of the institution, where it's even situated, the land that it's on. So these are really important questions. So I suppose you can't avoid these, but in each one of those buckets, I've tried to renegotiate the relations of power within the classroom and with my colleagues, and think about how we support teaching and learning that works with community within the institution, to think about how we're allocating resources. Is there a center for service learning? Who are the people that are partnering with communities? Are we exposing them to good practices? And I'm happy to share all of the techniques and things that we've done. And then how are we training people to do a decolonized form of research? We just did a presentation on that a couple of days ago. And then what does it mean to partner with communities in a way that's sensitive, that builds off of assets and strengths, as opposed to needs and a deficit approach? So that's a lot, that's a mouthful, but boy, it takes a long time. In my case, it's 1998 till now. And Bob can probably attest to the vision around Engage Cornell, but the last thing I want it to be is another colonizing practice. And by the way, I'm a townie in Ithaca. I'm from Ithaca. I did not have the same relationship with Cornell that a lot of people have, right? So I'm even doubly feeling responsible for how we interact even locally with community partners. As someone whose father was born here and whose father worked here, and so a couple of generations, Cornell's a big place, a big institution in Ithaca. So it can come across as something that a lot of people don't have access to, and yet it employs a lot of people.
Same for Duke and Durham. We have 5 minutes left on the formal session. And I want to bring up a theme that came up in one of our recent conversations as the transformative learning intellectual community, and that was the notion of joy. And I don't remember, maybe it was you, Corey, introduced joy as as a modus, as a mode of being and working and doing and studying and learning. And I'm wondering if we could bring the conversation that dealt with the obstacles and the difficulty and the biases and the lack of privilege and the complexities of transformative learning, and bring it back to the notion of joy that came out of our previous conversation. And who was it among our group that introduced that theme?
I think it was Liliana.
Liliana,
Liliana,
can you bring us to a close?
he is full of joy.
Be full of joy, Liliana.
Um,
Do our joyful dance.
yeah, I have to do that. Well, all these conversations are really important, and we are always, I think, questioning our own directions, and I think for me, it is important to find and define our activities as pedagogues, teachers, you know, in the context of joy as well, and to use the one of the phrases that you used, Richard, like if we're agents of change, not transformation, of change, then we need to find also the joy of the within the challenge. You know, it's not going to be it's not an easy road, but we want to also remember that this work has to remind us of why we do this, and the joy of interactions, the joy of connections, and the joy of the conversations that we have, and understanding that there are challenges that we still need to face, and the answers, we don't have the answers, and that sometimes we even don't know the right questions, how we are asking the right questions. And many times, and especially now, we forget about joy. Was that joyful enough? No.
It's wonderful. I mean, I feel joyful that we had this opportunity to have a conversation. I know from my own experience, working with and learning from community partners and colleagues who I've worked with over the years in different contexts, to build a better world together is deeply gratifying and joyful. And the celebrations that happen during and after we've engaged with each other are so powerful. They're inspirational. It keeps me going. So it's inherently a challenging process, but so gratifying when you can engage with challenges with people, walk away having learned so much more, and having had a positive impact on the world in places where maybe you didn't even think of, you know, that you had never connected with people in certain communities. That, you know, it builds lifelong friendships and relationships, as you say, Liliana. And so I'm thankful for that. I can't imagine what it would be like, no offense to anybody in the Zoom, to have lectured for the past 25 years. I think I would regret that. I'm so thankful that I was inspired by people in Nicaragua and my students to do this work and to take on the challenge. So, and I am thankful for you all inviting me. I hope you found it helpful and useful and thought-provoking. And I do hope we can continue the conversations. That would bring me joy as well.
Well, on behalf of the whole group here on this call and those beyond who will eventually listen to the recording, Richard, thank you for your time and for your insights and for the provocative remarks and sharing that occurred this evening now. David, any final thoughts?
I could stay here another 4 hours.
Well, we have time, don't we?
I haven't even asked some of my most important questions. So we got to have Richard back. Richard has to come back, and we have to do this again. There's so much depth to this. And if it's going to be a cornerstone of Duke University, we need, I want to tell the students, there are a lot of wonderful faculty here. These are the faculty that you need to be taking courses with if you're interested in transformation. Just scroll through the Zoom and just take a course with faculty here. And then we need to hold the institution's feet to the fire. You can't make this the cornerstone of undergraduate education and have no understanding of what it is. So thanks to Richard for bringing so much energy, passion, intellect, and joy this afternoon.
Mhm. I assume those of us who want to continue chatting can stay on the call. Everyone else, go forth and enjoy your evenings, and we'll see you all real soon.
Thank you, Richard. It's great
Thanks,
to
everybody.
see you.
Great to
Stay
see you,
safe.
Bob, Patty, everybody.
Great.